it's one thing that you're pretty vocal on is the issue of pro-life versus abortion, and also Planned Parenthood and the subsidies to Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pro-life. I think if you look at my religious views, take me there. But if you don't like religion, then how about science? I mean, you go to science. The scientific evidence is very clear that life begins at conception. There's just no debate there. So I understand that people are kind of stuck on science they learned when they were 15, when they were 30 years ago. But I mean, the science today, if you get with modern science, it's a no-brainer. The science begins, or life begins rather, at conception. And then besides that view, again, we're back to subsidies. Why should I take your money to give to Planned Parenthood, something that is horribly offensive to so many people, and they're profitable, so why are we taking money from you to give to them? And again, the Republicans and Democrats both do that. It's done at the local level many times, and it's done at the federal level. It's done that way for 40 years, and again, you'd hope the Republicans, the so-called pro-life party, would have stepped in and stopped that, but they didn't have the conviction to do that.
You mentioned, while we're still on the topic of abortion, for the people who are not familiar with abortion, maybe they've never heard of it, or maybe they're just now getting into politics, explain what abortion is, or what happens in an abortion, or just that issue in general.
Well, I mean, abortion is just the ending of a life in the womb, and so it can be done chemically, it can be done by all sorts of means. I mean, the most aggressive, nasty version of that is so-called partial birth abortions, things like that. So the ways that abortions are done vary tremendously. Being a pro-lifer, you probably know some of the history of abortion, going back, at least I've looked into it, at least back to the Roman era. What term was abortion known as, even in some of the history going back even further than the last 40 years? I think the most interesting thing about the history of abortion is when you look at where Planned Parenthood comes from, Margaret Sanger, its connection to eugenics, Darwinism, social Darwinism, racism. I mean, the history of abortion going back to where it really picked up pace about 120 years ago is pretty ugly. There's a great book on this by Marvin Olasky called Abortion Rights, R-I-T-E-S.
Like a ritual. Like a ritual.
And he talks about the history of abortion in America from colonial days, and it's a fascinating work. So abortion's been here forever. I think what makes it interesting is that with more technology is a neutral thing, but it can be used for good or ill.
It's become more efficient to perform an abortion?
Right, it's become easier to do that, and so when that happened, then you had ideologies embracing it or rejecting it, and those that embraced it came at a time when progressivism and social Darwinism and eugenics was high on the list of how people thought about the world, and led to racial purity arguments and all kinds of garbage like that.
One thing I wanted to point out, you're the first candidate that I've ever heard, other than Ron Paul, but especially the first candidate I've ever heard of who has connected abortion with eugenics. I've done some research into this. You mentioned Margaret Sanger. She had, I looked into it and found she had connections to the Ku Klux Klan. They were big fans of her because she preached racial hygiene, and she's the head of Planned Parenthood, and of course old man Rockefeller financed it. The one thing I just wanted to point out, I'm sure you're aware of this, but for anybody listening, the term that I was talking about for the old name for abortion was infanticide. Going back to the Romans, they knew which herbs could be ingested to induce a miscarriage. I guess, did you want to talk any more about the issue of abortion?
I think one more thing to add, if people are interested in the issue, I wrote a really I wrote a nice essay, interesting essay, in December of '07, because that '07 was the 100th anniversary of the nation's first state eugenics law, and it happened to be in Indiana. So Indiana was the first in the nation in passing a eugenics law, and so I wrote an essay on that. It appeared in a number of papers and stuff, and it's available on Sean's blog and maybe on the campaign website, I forget. But it's a very interesting topic to see how the philosophy and the public policies connect together.
Now, you mentioned that with the Eugenics Act, and you mentioned that it came up in Indiana. I didn't know that. I've lived in Indiana all my life. Have you lived in here all your life in Indiana?
Moved here in 1998 when we were building a house after the birth of after the adoption of our first son.
Just something I was thinking about while you mentioned Indiana and the first eugenics law is, you know, back in the 1920s, perhaps the 1930s, the Ku Klux Klan was very powerful in Indiana. D.C. Stevenson was one of the heads of them. Of course, the Ku Klux Klan is not what people think it is. It's very corrupt. Their own leader did some horrible things that most Klan members don't even know about. Do you think there might be a connection with that eugenics law being first implemented in Indiana and then the power of the Ku Klux Klan being powerful in Indiana?
It could be. I'm not sure about that connection. It wouldn't surprise me.
Because Margaret Sanger and eugenics and the Klan.
This is a longer story and not worth campaign discussion, but I mean, it's interesting that mainline Protestants were in favor of abortion. They saw it as part of, again, kind of a utopian view of Christianity, oddly, entering the 20th century. There's a famous magazine called The Christian Century that began in 1901, I think it was, and they really saw a Christian century ushering in post-millennial, you know, Christ will come at the end of this, and we're bringing the kingdom in, and they're going to use government to do it. So, you know, abortion, oddly, was a part of that, and it's so weird for us to think about today, but there were some really weird alliances, what today looked to us as very odd alliances back then.